Alors, on va justement passer à un cas qui est en recherche de ce type de reconnaissance, de labellisation. Et je passe donc tout de suite la parole à Dirk TROSKIE, qui est directeur of Business Planning and Strategy au département d'agriculture de Western Cape, en Afrique du Sud, et qui va nous parler de la certification de l'indication Certification of Geographical Indication in a Local and Regional Development Strategy. Floor is yours, Dirk.
Merci beaucoup. First, I would like to say thank you very much to the organizers of this conference for inviting me here. You know, last night when we walked back from this, the function and I walked through Paris, I realized why this is my favorite city in the world. So thank you very much for inviting me to be here.
You are welcome.
Thank you. The second thing I just want to say is that my responsibility is to develop strategy for the Western Cape Province Department of Agriculture. Now, this is the best job that you can get in the world. I get paid a lot of money to ask interesting questions. So you can take note, I've still got about 15 years to go. And after that, I retire. So anybody who's interested in my job in 50 years' time, it can be yours. You can start positioning yourself now. What I'm going to do is I'm quickly going to look at our local development strategy that we follow in the province. I'll have 2 slides on the DURAS project because there's a lot of people who has been working on this. And then I will talk about the components of successful GI in terms of 4 different case studies that we've developed. In terms of our local development strategy, we all know that there's the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit. We need to look at the people, our society. There's the natural environment, and there's the financial environment. Now, within that environment, there's a lot of things that we, from an agricultural perspective, cannot control. We cannot control, for instance, HIV and AIDS. That is something that is beyond our control. But it does not mean we can ignore it. We must take note of it, but it is outside our control. On the same side, in terms of water resources or climate change, it is something that happens, and yes, our activities can have an influence on that. But on a micro scale, on a farm level scale, you cannot really control it. You have to live with that. The same on the economic side. The exchange rate is extremely important for us. And traditionally, the European subsidies was something which our farmers has really considered to be a problem. But at the provincial level, we can do nothing about that. That is part of our environment. So what can we control? What is in that space that we can control? The first is our land, water, and climate. Now, land is obvious, the way the land will be used. The use it will be put to. Will it be put for agricultural use? Will it be building, etc.? Water resources, in our case, is extremely important. We're a water-dry country. And, of course, climate, yes, to a certain extent, one can have an influence on that by farming under protection and things like that. So there is something that we can control. That's part of our space. The second part of our space, and I'm an agriculture economist, so this is where I spend a lot of my time, is, of course, the production function or the profit function. Now, the profit function consists out of 2 elements. The first element is, of course, your income, the income side of this. And the second element is your expenditure. Now, on the income side, I have specifically used not the price of the income, but the concept of utility. Now, and I think today, or over the past 2 days, we've spoken actually a lot about the concept of utility. That everything derived from farming is not only in financial terms. It is something that can go, it's something, we can talk about feelings. Somebody this morning said about feelings, we must bring feelings back into the debate. Now, I can remember a year or so ago at the Farmers Association meeting, one of the farmers stood up and he said, you know, in front of all his peers, he stood up and he said, every morning on his farm there's a little koppie, what in Afrikaans we would say a koppie, you'd say a hill. There's a little hill. And he's sitting on that hill and look as the sun rises. And he look at the small plants, you know, the small succulent plants on his farm. And he can't help but shed some tears because the deity gave him the responsibility to look after this landscape and after this plant. So what is in this concept of utility is much more than finance. Okay, and then in between all this are the human nexus, are the people that arrange the system. And linking all this, linking from the natural environment to human and from humans to your profit function is the rules and regulations we put in place, is the institutional mechanisms we put in place. So this is basically the way we see the space that we as agriculture occupy within our society. Now, within that space, there are quite a number of interventions that we do have. Of course, we looked at, there's certain interventions on the natural environment, on human resource development, the rural development, research and technology, and the way we farm, the way farmers use systems that influence how the various inputs are combined in this production function of ours. Then we've got a market access, marketing strategy, and the rest of my presentation I will focus on one part of this market access strategy of ours, and then of course we've got food security and the human elements and the institutional elements. So this is in short, I like pictures. You know, I can't think in words. That's why I'm not a lawyer. I think in pictures. So that is why I've got this particular picture to make sense out of what we are doing. Now, part of our market access strategy is to say, how do we use the quality elements within this bigger system of ours? How do we use this quality element to access markets and to make sure that on a domestic and international level, that we get the best return on our inputs? Now, there's a very complicated graph, and I'm not going to go into that detail. I'd rather go into the Duras project. Now, like most good things in life, this project was, there was a number of co-workers in this, University of Pretoria, us from the Western Cape government, and if you talk about GI, you will find some French connections somewhere. So in this instance also, CIRAD was involved in that, Namibian Department of Agriculture and Industry Organizations. And our purpose was to develop some case studies of potential geographical indicators in South Africa and in Namibia. There were 6 case studies that we've evaluated. The first one is rooibos, then honeybush. Now, both of these are in species that you will only find in the Cape, in the Cape area, which is a heritage site. Then the third one was Karoo lamb, and the particular picture you've got there is also, that picture was taken in the succulent Karoo. And the succulent Karoo, or the reservations in the succulent Karoo, has also applied for protection as a heritage site. Then come the Boom Mower, Kalahari melon seed, and Swakara. The last two, the melon seed and the Swakara, were basically the Namibian case studies in this exercise. Now, as part of our going into this exercise, we have identified, and during this whole project, we have identified what is the components of a successful geographical indicator. And what we find is that there must be an artifact, there must be something, and that something consists out of a product, place, and people. There must be a system, and there must be a demand for that. And I will, for the rest of this presentation, I will use these 4 case studies and explain some findings that we got out of the exercise. There we go. Now, the first one is, of course, was rooibos. Now, rooibos tea on the left-hand side is grown in an extremely harsh condition. And in the winter, in the winter time, we get rain of about 200 millimeters, And after the first rain, the whole area flowers. Now, especially in those areas where the soil has been disturbed, you get this wonderful flowers in that particular areas. Then, now in this particular case, that flowers is in between the rooibos rows that has been planted. In summer, your temperature goes up to 50 degrees Celsius in that particular area. So it is not for sissies, okay? It's a harsh environment. The second slide is, okay, the rooibos is indigenous to this Cape Floral area, which is also a heritage site. The second is honeybush, which is in a totally different area, but it is still same of part of the same heritage area. It is also an indigenous product, but there are 23 different species of honeybush, of which we only produce 4 of those for commercial value. Karoo lamb, a range of species, merino, dorper, etc., being produced on that. So the species doesn't matter, the area is important, and I'll come back to that later. And then mohair from Angora goats. Now, the Angora goat on your right-hand side here, that is basically a goat that originally came from the Angora mountains in Turkey. It has been domesticated in South Africa, and it has been farmed for about 150 years. Now, I've heard a lot here about heritage and history and things like that. And I think to date, the Burgundy people has set the limit. They talked about, I think if I read correctly, 235 years odd after Christ. They can trace the history back. Now, we can trace our history back to 256 million years ago. 256 million years ago, the area which is currently the Karoo was surrounded by mountains as high as the Himalayas are today. And through a process of erosion, that high mountains got eroded into this inland lake, which was a very shallow lake, and it set off layers of rock, of sediments. And that sediments solidified, and basically you can't see clearly there, but you can clearly see how the mud settled down 200 and 300 million years ago. Now, in that mud, in that rock, there is a lot of fossils has been captured there. And, it was for me, well, actually the week before Christmas, well, I again went into the Karoo and hunted some fossils. And the experience you have if you open this rock, and in that rock there is a fossil that for the first time in 300 million years see the light. This is some way of discovering. That's an experience that is very difficult to explain. Now, this particular geology, combined with the climate of this area, give rise to this type of landscape, which is very typical in terms of the plateau of the koppies, of the hills that has been developed, as well as the shrubs, which one can find in there. And that shrubs give a taste to the meat. So we can trace it from the geology to the plants to the area where it is grown. Now, in this right-hand side, in that map, the dots you will see is where this plants is common. And the area that has been shaded there is about 50% of the area of South Africa, which is a fairly large area. Now, here we've run into a problem because, and I haven't heard this problem here over the past 2 days. Where do you draw the borders of the area you want to protect? Because I don't know about your farmers, perhaps they are much meeker than ours, but our guys are extremely hard-headed. So as soon as you get out a map and you draw a line on that map, you create all sorts of problems for everybody. Because somewhere along the line, that line is going to run through a guy's farm, and he is going to take you to court. Or it will be 2 neighbors, and the one guy is in and the other guy is out, and you have got all sorts of problems. So we said, okay, the only way we can solve this problem is to have soft borders. So we've got the green area, which we consider to be the heartland of the Karoo. And we said, if you are farming in that particular area, it's fine. You're allowed to call your mutton or your lamb Karoo lamb. If you are in the area outside that, if you can prove that on your farm, that bushes are on your farm, then you are allowed to call your lamb Karoo lamb. So we created the sort of soft borders where the proof of evidence is given to the farmer. And if that farmer can prove, then that person can be in. Now, it worked very good, except for one farmer. And I've also heard the Burgundy guys talked about one farmer yesterday. There's one farmer right in that small area over there where the green and the grey and the yellow meet. There's one guy there. And he's giving us all sorts of problems. Thanks. We're done. There, right there, that guy there. You know, he's giving us all sorts of problems. He's been writing to the minister. And we've been making backward somersaults while we're whistling the national anthem, but we can't get him to budge. So he's keeping back the whole exercise. Okay, so that is the link to the area which are important. In Kamdeboe, this is also in the Karoo. This is a different part of the Karoo. Now, what is important is that mountain is the Kamdeboe mountain. So it is very much iconic of this particular area. The problem here is that this is the map of farmers producing this type of moe. And evidently, it is not linked to this particular area anymore. So that created another dimension for us in this whole process. In case of rooibos and honeybush, this rooibos, this is the small town of Wuppertal. It's a missionary station right in the middle of the Cederberg Mountains, which are protected. But this area itself is not part of the heritage site. It is adjacent to the heritage site. So this has got a long history of about 300 years as a missionary station. And we are actually moving into a direction of, over the next year or so, to preserve this, not necessarily as a international heritage site, but at least at the local level. This is where your honeybush is grown, typical mountains, and this is in the reserve that has been protected. Now, people are extremely important in the production processes of all these. One of these photos show a lot of traditional ways that people are actually going about this. And I don't know if you know, but this guy is currently the world champion for hand shearing of sheep. Now, this is something that you won't quite often find in the rest of the world. But in South Africa, a lot of hand shearing is still taking place. So that's a traditional practice. The way harvesting is taking place is very labor intensive. And I was listening to the Colombian coffee case study, because I think to a large extent we are running into the same type of problems, where you've got traditional practices, but the world is moving on out there. How do we create our protection without in such a way limiting innovation in this industry that it can't take on new developments? Okay, in terms of institutional framework, in case of both rooibos and honeybush, there is associations which can protect, which can take custodianship of this. So there was no problem. But we ran into a problem with the Karoo lamb case study, because there was no association which could take ownership of this. We tried our best to get farmers on board. And you go and speak to farmers at farmers' days, etc. And everybody is saying, yes, this is important. We need to protect this heritage of ours. And then you said at the end of the meeting, okay, now we must go forward. Who will be volunteers to serve on this committee? And everybody said, no, I've got a cow to milk, and I'm busy. You guys from outside, you've got a lot of time, so please take it forward. So that is part of the problem we've been running to in terms of the Karoo example. Kam de Boer is a private company has been registered. I'm not going to go into the detail of this for the sake of time. But what I want to show here is two things. The first thing is that the rooibos value chain is extremely complex. Okay, there's a lot of phases and steps into this. So one of the challenges we had to have is, so what do we protect in this very complex value chain? Where do we try to stop that? That's the first part of the argument here. The second part is that in this area, functional foods, beverages, and nutraceuticals, it's an increasingly exploding type of environment. So whatever we do, we had to make sure that we don't dampen any developments which can take place in this part of the exercise. So to summarize the value chains in terms of rooibos, it's complex with new products. So we decided to certify loose tea at that stage. Honeybush the same. Karoo lamp is a simple value chain. And there we could certify the consumer product as it goes in the final instance to the consumer. Kam de Boer mohair is very complex, and the decision was to have a swing tag on the inside in your jackets that go in there. In the consumer market of rooibos, what is important here is that a very important thing happened here around 2000. For around 2000, the export market of rooibos became much more important than the domestic market. But here's another challenge for us. And our challenge is, how do we get the French to the party? Because we know that the French will like our rooibos tea and our honeybush tea. But for some or other reason, it doesn't get into the French market. So in 2003 it was not, in 2010 it's still not very much a well-known tea here. So any advice will be appreciated, how we can enter the French market. In terms of quality perceptions and reputation, we ran a willingness to pay experiment for Karoo lamp. And about 2 years ago in a supermarket in the Western Cape, and part of this willingness to pay experiment, you know, normally with willingness to pay experiments, you get a few people around the table and you give them paper money, or even you give them €100 and say, okay, you can buy something or you can pocket the money, but it's not their own money. Okay? So what we did here it was on a weekend, people wanted to buy some meat to braai. It's their own money, it's not somebody else's money. So we had Karoo Natural Lamp there, and Checkers had their own brand, Karoo Natural Lamp, was there. So our Karoo lamp was sold at a premium of about 50 above that of the own brand. And over that period, we took 50% of the sales away of the existing brand of the Checkers Natural Lamp. So there's a clear reputation associated with Karoo. But there's also a big problem that we face with people selling Karoo Natural Lamp without it necessarily being the real product. And how do we manage that? So that was part of the whole exercise. This is a very interesting story about Kam de Boer mohair. When President Obama was inaugurated for the first time as the President of the United States, his wife had a jersey on. And nobody in the fashion magazines, etc., in the US could identify where this product comes from. So in the end, they went, you know, the journalist went on a spree and they tried to identify it, and they traced it back to Japan, where the material comes from. And from Japan, they then could trace back it all the way to the farm with a guy with the name of Philip Michau in the Cradock area. So because the good systems and the traceability was in place, they could trace it back all the way. Okay. I'm not going to go into this. The final slide is that if you want to certify something, you are inevitably going to exclude certain products. So what happens to the excluded product? So there must be a secondary market. And there we are sitting with a problem. In the case of rooibos, there are no secondary market. In the case of honeybush, there are no secondary market. Karoo lamp and Kamdeboer mohair, there are secondary markets. And in the case of Kamdeboer mohair, they receive a 25% price premium. Okay, in conclusion, I think from our perspective, a geographical indicator is an extremely important part of our rural development strategy that we follow in the province, to build the export market and to manage the quality in our domestic market. There are certain things that need to be in place for a successful GI, but a GI is not a silver bullet. There are, in certain instances, it can work. In this case, rooibos, honeybush, and karoo lamp, it can work. In Kamdeboer mohair, no, it cannot work. And I think that is the principle. Whatever you do is, there's a whole range of tools that one can use to protect heritage, to protect an area, to protect the product. This is one tool. And we must never only look at one tool. One must look at the range of tools which is available and use the appropriate tool for the appropriate situation. Chairperson, thank you very much for this opportunity. And you're welcome to contact me. Thanks.
Thank you, Dirk, for this very comprehensive illustration of what David Troskie has presented to us this morning.